All right, gentlemen, you gave me a video chat and I'm going to give you a video reply. So no reading necessary in this discussion activity here. By the way, yes, I am standing out of my beautiful backyard with my beautiful pool. We'll be here for about another month. Actually, we're in the process of moving. I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but this is my pool for another month. So I just wanted to respond, and I took really good notes, and I did make it to the end, by the way. Craig, I did not fall asleep during Eric's discursus there on strategic change. I made it all the way through. So let me just sort of comment. I'm going to go through and kind of comment. I thought it'd be easier for me to comment verbally rather than try to type out, 2 pages of responses. Because I did listen, I was paying attention, and I think I can give you some feedback here maybe to clarify or kind of tie it all into a nice little bow. First of all, I just say good job. Really glad you guys are taking up this opportunity to do this in this format. Hopefully you liked it. Just as I was listening, I was just thinking sort of the richness of the dialogue, and that's really something you miss in the typical written dialogue forms. So being able to do this and kind of bounce off each other and throw out examples, it was really good. So hopefully you guys appreciated the opportunity to do it like this. So I was overall pretty happy with how things went, although I'll make some comments here in a bit. So y'all started off talking about power, and this is one that, we just kind of threw you right into the deep end, right? This is sort of the one that's a bit challenging, especially from a Christian perspective. Jelani mentioned, Jesus' admonition not to lord things over others and to practice servant leadership. But on the other hand, we also know that all power and authority has been given to Jesus, right? So power is a real dynamic. There is spiritual power. There's also spiritual authority and other types of authority that have been given to us human leaders. By the way, I live under the flight path here, so we might hear some planes going by every once in a while. What are you going to do? One of the things I won't miss about living in this house here. So that's a tension, right, that we're always going to have to kind of live with to a certain degree in church leadership. We know we have authority, and there's nothing wrong with acknowledging the different types of power that we have. So that expert power, the legitimate power, right? So French and Ravens is 5 points of power. And I think, Jelani, you did a good job of talking about that, and then talking about your interplay with your volunteers versus your staff, and how you try to empower your volunteers, and you treat them in a similar way, right? Now, you didn't mention, and again, we don't have to divulge these things, right? But sometimes we feel like we can use more of that legitimate power, right, and that reward power with paid staff folks. And I think from a church leadership perspective, we're probably always going to be aware of the distinction between how we treat leaders, how we treat paid staff, and how we treat volunteer staff in terms of how we use power. And I think this is good. I think really in a lot of ways, leading volunteers takes a very much more delicate, sense of leadership and motivation, right? Because we can't fall back on the old, well, I'm the boss one, right? We really have to tap into people's aspirations and get them on our team, and all those sorts of things. So I thought that was an interesting conversation there. Craig, I liked your idea of authority is like soap. I might use that one. And I think the idea here, it took you all a minute to figure this out, but I think the idea here is the more you use it, the less you really have, because authority is something that's, if you have to use it, you're actually diminishing your legitimate authority, right? So if you have to wield it, it's sort of like it's kind of like the guy who has to constantly remind people, well, I'm the boss. Remember who's in charge here, right? That's a coercive approach to power, right? So I think the essence of that idea is that real authority comes from not having to actually say I'm the boss, and to sort of wield that coercive approach. So it's much better to be able to inspire people, to get them on the same team, to think about some of these other ways, referent power. People follow us and serve us and obey us because they like us and they genuinely believe in us and our mission and all the things that we're doing. And then Eric, you talked about sort of this false sense of unity that can come when there is this coercive leadership. And we've probably all been in situations, maybe churches or other organizations, where people were on the same page, but only because there was a fear of stepping outside of the official, power structure. So domineering authoritarian leaders can get people to have this sense of unity, but it's really only as long as we are obeying that particular person or staying within the lines, right? So this happens, if you guys remember in the OB class, we talked about group dynamics and groupthink, right? So I think groupthink is sort of that ultimate expression of, we're afraid to step outside of the conventional wisdom and the norms of the group because we don't want to displease the leader, we don't want to seem like an outsider or an oddball, those sorts of things. So that's another interesting angle to think about. To think about authority as sort of like how group norms and power dynamics really display what types of power they display. Let's see, Jelani, you talked about charismatic leaders, and that there's really no discussion, but just submission. And this really is a type of, I think you said this, I put quotes on it, it's a type of legitimate power abuse, right? Because charismatic leaders, they are in charge, right? They're on the top of the food chain and everything, but they can abuse their power. And unfortunately in the church, we've seen that. You guys gave a great example of Mars Hill. Somebody mentioned there was a good podcast on that. But this is kind of another one of those tensions in the church, right? It's like, how do these people become powerful and they really have a genuine spiritual authority? They move in the gifts and they're able to really inspire, motivate people. But on the other hand, they can be coercive and abusive and abuse their power. And Craig, I really liked your example of how the international leaders, or you've seen that example of how international leaders, this is like over the top, right? So I thought that was very interesting. I guess it didn't surprise me a whole lot, right? Because we know that different countries, especially African countries and developing countries, they don't have the same sense of democracy, and so those who are afforded power are given kind of like absolute power. And I'm not saying they're all dictatorships, but we know, for example, in Africa, they have this concept of the big man, right? So the big man is in charge, and you don't go against the big man. And I think that kind of mentality, sort of a dictatorship, big man, sort of seeps into church leadership. And they're like, all right, I'm the big man in the church here. And so there's all kinds of potential for abuse. So again, this is a challenging tension that we live with in the church. Along the way, this is where you guys started talking about doing a podcast. Work on that one a little bit, fellas. If you give me something substantial there, maybe you can twist my arm, but I'm still sticking with the literature review paper for now. Although, the three of you, if you guys hone your act a little bit here, this might actually be interesting for people to view and to learn something. That would be an amazing thing. I might give you some extra credit if you pull that one off, all right? All right, we'll call it the Three Amigos Leadership Podcast Hour or something like that. Okay. Then you guys talked about strategic leadership. I thought that was nice. Well, Jelani, you mentioned how Gateway Church does strategy well. I think we've all observed that as well. I would have liked to have heard some more specifics though, right? Because again, you guys are master students here, right? So it's a little vague to say this church, this organization does this well. Okay, perhaps they do, but you guys, it's really, you have to demonstrate, you got to back up statements like that. So I would have liked to have seen some specificity, like what aspects of strategic leadership do you think Gateway Church does that resonates with what we know, with what we know about strategy? So is it the planning? Is it the iterative nature? Is it the responsiveness to change in the environment? So when you throw out these concepts, try to get a little more nuanced and a little specific. I think that'll help me really to understand that you guys get this, okay? So I'm not doubting that what you said was true, but I really want to hear you guys articulate some specifics, right? So don't say Gateway Church is good at strategy. Say, hey, we do these practices and the best practices are here, right? So you can kind of demonstrate real specifically what you mean when you say Gateway Church does strategy good. Okay, so enough said on that. Craig, I like you talked about spiritual climate change. That was a great term. That's quotable, right? So we talk about climate change. I don't know if you made that one up, man, but you should copyright that because I really like that. Our culture is changing, and I think you all talked about the need for the church to sort of navigate these kind of sea changes that we're seeing in our culture in a lot of ways. Eric, I liked your discussion on higher education which is slow to change. And hey, that's been my world for 20 years. You're preaching to the choir here, but I would agree with you. I think the interesting thing about this season that we're kind of going through, hopefully we're getting through by the grace of God, this sort of COVID season is change. Sometimes change comes from this sort of strategic idea, right? Well, we see the need to change, and now we're going to implement some new strategy. We're going to get people to change. We're going to get them to see the need to change as we do as the strategic leaders, right? What was different with COVID was it didn't take a whole lot of coercing, did it, to get people to understand that this is a massive change here, and if we don't adapt and adapt soon, we're going to be out of business, so to speak. And we've kind of sadly seen this. Some of the smaller churches that weren't able to pivot have lost members. And the larger churches like Gateway, they were already poised technologically to do technologically mediated services. And it's amazing how the whole Gateway Gatherings things kind of emerged out of this, right? I don't know if that was already in the works, but think about that wonderful idea, that strategy to really reach people, have them cluster together all over the world in Gateway Gatherings. I mean, see, again, sometimes we have opportunities. Sometimes radical changes in the climate give us opportunities to minister in a way that we wouldn't have before. And you don't really have to work that hard to get people to buy into it, right? They're like, okay, we get it. Yes, change or die, right? So I think what we've learned in this from a leadership perspective is that, change and change dynamics really has a lot to do with the sense of urgency presented by the situation. So in normal times, it's going to be, and this might be my kind of rule of thumb here, right, that we could gather from this. In normal, stable times, it's going to be harder to get people to change. But during turbulent times, or sea change times, if you will, then I think the change may be a little bit easier because the necessity to change is going to be visible to folks. So I don't know. I think there's an opportunity for some research there, but it seems to me I think that's what we're seeing as a result of COVID is people's responsiveness to leadership's call for change is going to be easier. And then Jelani, you talked about the coping cycle during the change process and how it's similar to the grieving cycle, right? And I think, in a lot of ways, you can say that a change really organizationally is sort of like the death of something. And when we experience that, we go through the same stages. So we deny it, we get angry about it, we blame about it, we get depressed about it, and then finally, we accept it, or we move on, right? This is something you don't get in the grieving cycle. You can't, in the natural, you don't move on, right? But in an organizational sense, you can leave. I mean, there's nothing to stop people from saying, no, I don't like that change. I don't like where the organization is going. I'm out of here. But if you want to keep people in the game, you have to kind of make it okay for them to go through grieving the loss of what used to be. Not that you have a funeral for the old or anything that morbid, but it's okay. I mean, if people are angry, if people are depressed, that should be expected. In fact, what shouldn't be expected is for everybody to go, yay, hip hooray. I mean, unless, this whole COVID situation notwithstanding, people have to have time to adapt to the change and to go through their own mental and emotional gyrations when it comes to the organizational change. And Eric, I liked your example of higher ed, and having been in higher ed and having seen some of the changes, I think I know what you're talking about here in terms of the pivot that TKU has made. I can totally relate. And being on the faculty side, I can see the faculty's, resistance to going online and all those sorts of things. And it has been challenging, and quite frankly, it is still challenging. And hopefully technologies like this and stuff kind of make it a little bit easier. I feel like I'm teaching even though I don't get immediate feedback, but we can come up with new creative ways to teach. Again, COVID presents an opportunity not just for churches, but for every organization type, including higher ed, to come up with new ways of doing things that are effective and maybe even more effective in some circumstances. So that's all I would have to say about that. And then y'all talked about Gotter's 8-step change process. And this model's been around for a long time. I learned this one when I was in seminary. I think what I would probably encourage you guys to do, because you notice there was a difference. I'm not sure if Craig was using Cotter's initial book, Leading Change, which is a classic. And I'm not sure if you guys read that for Sam Rockwell's class. That's the kind of book that you would read in his class, but I know that our chapter talked about it. But the chapter had a little bit different, and I was wondering if there was any, out of this 8, if any of them were a little bit different. I think the language was different. So in the original textbook, if I recall, it's the Guiding Coalition. I think, or the original book, Cotter's book, Guiding Coalition, we talk about guiding team, right? So you can kind of see, because teams now are more fashionable, so they kind of use the language of guiding team rather than guiding coalition. But I think the change process is the same. And Eric, I liked your example of how you saw your own your student services reorg thing. You kind of use that model. Now, I don't know if you intentionally used it, or in hindsight you say, yeah, we did some of those things. Now, I'd like to think that maybe you know, what strategic leadership is about is kind of being intentional about some of these things, not kind of looking back and saying, oh, guess what, we did that, well, yay for us. But it's saying, how can we leverage some of these principles of change, you know, unfreezing, changing, celebrating small wins, those sorts of things, being real intentional about those things, because we know that that's what makes change initiatives successful. So anyhow, listen, I'm going 15 minutes here. I hope you guys didn't fall asleep when I was talking, but this has been great. I'm going to post this in the thread. If y'all want to give me any feedback, written, whatnot, that would be great. One other thing I want to mention, I noticed that you guys did the reflective questions this way, and then you posted your journal smackdown. I like that. I was kind of wondering if you were going to do both of them here, but I think with the amount of content, I think an hour is probably enough just to cover those reflective questions, let alone each of you explaining a journal article to each other who haven't necessarily read it. So I'm fine if you guys want to stick with that. And I think thinking through and writing out the journal article summaries is going to probably help you more for your lit review than if you guys just chat about it. So this kind of happened incidentally, but I'm glad it happened this way. So let's just keep this format, if you don't mind. Chat about the reflection questions, and then do your post on the journal article, which you can then use as part of your lit review. And it's really helping you, I think more critically about the journal articles in a way that just talking through them might not. So anyhow, that's it for me today. God bless you guys. I'm happy with the way the class is going, and look forward to pursuing on in this class with you. So God bless you. Enjoy the rest of your day.